attend Seymour David Steinman lectures. My name is Dan Siri. I teach. I'm an associate professor here in the School of Religious Studies. And I'd like to extend a warm welcome to our honored guests, faculty members, or distinguished guest speakers tonight. The topic tonight is focused on immigration, minority rights, religious freedom, both in the U.S. and in the Canadian context. The lecture series, this is an inaugural lecture series, this is the fourth and final installment of this lecture series for this inaugural year, is dedicated to the memory of the Seymour David Steinman. Mr. Steinman was a lawyer, graduate of McGill, and in his retirement was keenly interested in issues around the intersection of religion and culture, and he was actually doing a master's at the Department of Jewish Studies at McGill. And in part, the inspiration for the lecture series comes out of his own work, engagement, public engagement, professional engagement with these issues over the course of his life. And also spearheaded, I think, by his family, and in particular his wife, Linda Stein, and his daughter, Lauren Steinman. The lecture this particular evening, too, is also supported by Eric and Catherine Jarvis, who've been helping to spearhead a lecture series that has been going on for the last 6 years. And this is the 6th of those lecture series, so thank you to the Jarvises for their work over the years and bringing together a really distinguished group of speakers to contribute to an ongoing conversation about religion in the public sphere. I'll turn the floor over to Lauren Steinman. Lauren is a PhD student in the School of Religious Studies, and her own work is in part inspired by some of the work and concerns that shaped her father's life, dealing with questions of religion in the public sphere and questions of discrimination. Lauren.
Hello, just making sure it works. Good evening. My name is Lauren, and I would like to take this moment to welcome you to the Seymour David Steinman Memorial Lecture Series that is on the question of preventing extremism, violence, anti-Semitism, and religious discrimination. Judeo-Christian tradition is replete with laws and teachings that instruct individuals on how to live a life of dignity and righteousness. It is within this framework that we are called to an adherence of the Ten Commandments, which stipulates a series of laws that God delivered to Moses in the book of Exodus. The fifth commandment states that one should honor one's parents in the context of their lifetime. While I adhere to this precept throughout my past childhood and adult years, it is this principle which informs the present lecture series. It is through this project that I have chosen to readapt the commandment to honor the memory of a departed parent, my father, Seymour David Steinman. My late father, Seymour, was a graduate of McGill University, having obtained his Bachelor of Arts in 1959 and a civil law degree in 1964. One of his most distinctive traits was his inquisitive mind. He was ever curious about the complex dimensions of the contemporary world and sought to leave no stone unturned in his quest for knowledge. My father was highly interested in current events and was intrigued by the disciplines of political science, religion, and history. In his later years, he had been enrolled in a master's program at McGill in the Department of Jewish Studies. He felt deeply rooted in his identity as a Jewish Canadian, both through tradition and the wider culture. He was profoundly concerned by the ongoing problem of anti-Semitism and its impact on Jewish communities worldwide, in addition to the increasing presence of nativist ideological rhetoric in contemporary political discourse. The goal of this lecture series is to bridge together my current PhD research with my father's personal interest in social diversity and the problem of systemic discrimination that targets minority groups and vulnerable populations in the contemporary world. extremism and violence, which we as Quebecers and as Canadians are attempting to navigate and grasp in this ever-changing social landscape. The overarching topic of tonight's lectures is that of immigration, minority rights, and religious freedom in the United States and Canada. Dr. Eric Jarvis, Professor of Psychiatry at McGill, will be the moderator for tonight's lectures. I will now hand over the floor to Dr. Jarvis to introduce tonight's speakers.
Thank you. It's my great pleasure to present Professor Nathan Oman, who will speak to us first tonight. And just to let you know, we'll have the speakers go for about 30 minutes each, and then after that we'll have time for questions. So first I'd like to tell you a bit about Nathan Oman, just some biographical information. Professor Oman is the Rita Ann Rollins Professor of Law at William and Mary Law School in Virginia, where he has taught since 2006. His scholarship has focused on the philosophy of private law and religion. Among his other interests, he has written extensively on the legal history of the Latter-day Saint movement and is currently writing a book on the Mormon legal tradition. He has authored several amicus briefs in the United States Supreme Court on issues related to religious freedom, including a brief on behalf of scholars of Mormon history filed in the litigation over President Trump's travel ban. Prior to becoming an academic, he practiced law in Washington, D.C., served as a clerk for a U.S. Federal Court of Appeals judge, and worked as a staffer in the United States Senate. He was educated at Harvard Law School and Brigham Young University. So Professor Oman is going to be talking about travel bans, Mormon and Muslim, Trump versus Hawaii, and the 19th century attack on Latter-day Saint immigration. Professor Oman.
Thank you very much for having me here. Unfortunately, I have to put on reading glasses. My children insist they make me look like Harry Potter, so I hope this is a magical experience for you as well. Okay, so during the run-up to the 2006 election, then candidate Donald Trump, who at the time was lagging in the primaries, made a Hail Mary move and called in the somewhat implicit phrase in his press release, a total and complete shutdown of Muslims entering the United States until our country's representatives can figure out what is going on. To the surprise of many people, Donald Trump went on to win the election in 2016. And President Trump made good on his campaign promise almost immediately. Within 1 week of being inaugurated as president, he issued an executive order which purported to ban any entry into the United States by refugees, asylum seekers, or even people just traveling on tourist visas into the United States from a number of Islamic countries. However, the ban tried to exclude what in the language of the executive order was called religious minorities from the scope of the event. In practice, what that meant was from these majority Muslim countries, Christians from those countries would not be excluded under the ban. So this ban was immediately challenged in federal court, multiple times in federal court. And ultimately, the Trump administration, rather than trying to litigate this particular ban, just abandoned the litigation and revoked the executive order. A few months later, in March, they reissued the executive order, a redrafted version of it, that created just a straight-up ban on any travel from 6 different countries, Iran, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, Syria, and Yemen, into the United States. That travel ban was then again challenged in federal court and ultimately litigated up to the United States Supreme Court. where in a decision called Trump versus Hawaii, the Supreme Court upheld the legality of President Trump's actions. And as Dr. Jarvis mentioned, during that litigation, he filed an amicus brief with the Supreme Court, trying to draw the court's attention to a historical analogy in American history in which there was religious discrimination that was exercised against immigrants to try and restrict entry into the United States on the basis of religion. Now, to understand this story, which is a little bit weird, you have to understand something about the history of immigration law in the United States. Strangely enough, the United States Constitution, which grants lots of different powers to the federal government of the United States, does not grant to the federal government of the United States the power to pass laws regulating immigration. And for most of the 19th century, the assumption was that actually the federal government did not have the power to legislate in this area, and that the regulation of immigration into the United States was actually left to state governments. And so until the 1870s, there was no federal law in the United States regulating immigration. So what changed at the end of the 19th century? And what you can see is this cartoon. So what this cartoon is showing is Uncle Sam's problem children. And if you look at the picture, we've got Uncle Sam in bed, and he's already in bed with three problem children. The three problem children are Native Americans, African Americans, and this is a drunken Catholic Irishman. The problem children that Uncle Sam is kicking out of bed, wants to keep from coming into bed, right, are the Chinese and the Mormons. Okay, so what did those groups have to do with each other? It starts in California. Okay, so in California, there was a massive Chinese immigration into California at the end of the 19th century. Much of the Transcontinental Railroad was actually constructed by Chinese immigrants, and they were not at all popular in California. So you can see here, this is an advertisement for an anti-Chinese rally in California. The cartoon there is an anti-Chinese cartoon that was in the official organ of the California Working Men's Party. And what they wanted to do was restrict Chinese immigration because these immigrants were coming into the United States and stealing American jobs, which is something that might sound familiar. So what happened? California passed a law to restrict Chinese immigration. And how did they do this? They passed a law that excluded all lewd, debauched, or abandoned women from entering into the state of California. And in practice, what that meant was Chinese women. Because the California law created a presumption that if a Chinese woman came into the state of California, she was presumed to be a prostitute, unless she could prove that she was married. And because of problems with documents and language and other sorts of things you can imagine, it was almost impossible for a Chinese woman arriving at the dock in San Francisco to prove that she was married, so she was presumed under California law to be a prostitute and could therefore be expelled from the state. Surprisingly, that law was declared unconstitutional by a federal court in a case called In Ah Hong, as treading on Congress's power to regulate commerce with foreign countries. Congress responded with something called the Page Act in 1875. The Page Act is very important. It's the first time the United States Congress ever attempts to regulate immigration in the United States. And what the Page Act did is simply reenacted the California law as federal law, right, which created this assumption that Chinese women were lewd and debauched women that were prostitutes and could be excluded from the United States on that basis. The Page Act was upheld as constitutional by the U.S. Supreme Court, and Congress then upped the ante in 1882 and passed something called the Chinese Exclusion Act, which simply made it illegal for people from China to immigrate into the United States. And the Chinese Exclusion Act was upheld as constitutional by the U.S. Supreme Court. One of the things you'll notice, right, is that the law around immigration centered on issues of sexuality and marriage. Right? Interestingly enough, in 1882, Congress also passed another law called the Edmunds Act. The Edmunds Act, passed in 1882, was part of the federal government's ongoing effort to suppress the religious practice of polygamy by Latter-day Saints in the United States. And as we're against the Latter-day Saints also took the form, eventually, of immigration restrictions. So, a little bit of background. The Mormon question, as it was called, was one of the recurring, ongoing political debates and issues of the late 19th century. So the Mormon Church, or the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, as it's formerly known, was founded in upstate New York in 1830 by a man named Joseph Smith, who claimed to be a prophet. Almost immediately, the Mormons began gathering converts. They almost immediately began international converts, right? So within the first year or two of the religion, there were Mormon missionaries who were traveling across the Great Lakes in Canada, and they were reaping Canadian converts. The Mormons would then gather together in their own settlements, and particularly the Mormon settlements in Missouri evoked massive mob violence against the Latter-day Saints, first in Jackson County, and eventually in northern Missouri, where functionally what happened was a small-scale civil war in northern Missouri between anti-Mormon mobs and the Mormon militia. Among the anti-Mormon rhetoric against the Latter-day Saints was anti-immigrant rhetoric. So Mormons in Missouri were castigated, I love this phrase, as being a debauched band of Canadian banditti. And Missouri wanted nothing to do with this invasion of Canadian bandits. So eventually the Mormons give up on the United States, and they make a big trek west to Mexico in 1847 to escape the jurisdiction of the United States. That proves unsuccessful because America annexes half of Mexico in 1848. And they find themselves once more within the United States. And that launches a long, long conflict with the federal government. At the center of this conflict is plural marriage. So the topic tonight is immigration, crime, and sex, which hopefully makes the presentation more interesting. So the idea of plural marriage as, or polygamy as a religious duty or a religious practice goes back to the Bible. So the Latter-day Saints saw themselves as following the example of ancient patriarchs in the book of Genesis. And actually the idea of religious polygamy, religious sanctioned polygamy, is something that kind of kicks around the fringes of the Radical Reformation and Radical Protestantism from at least the 16th century on. The most famous advocate here is our gentleman here on the right. That's John Milton of Paradise Lost fame. He also wrote some wonderfully strange and bizarre theological treatises, which among other things advocated for the legitimacy of plural marriage. So the Mormons begin secretly practicing plural marriage in the 1840s. In 1852, they publicly endorsed the practice of plural marriage as a religious commandment, and they proceed to practice it until in 1890 they publicly claim to abandon the practice of plural marriage. They don't really abandon it in 1890. It continues to happen sort of secretly on a kind of ad hoc basis until 1904. And in 1904 is the date when the Mormons really abandon polygamy. That's the date at which they start excommunicating any polygamists from their church. So it was this long battle, or this long polygamous period, basically between 1852 and 1900, in which the Mormons found themselves locked in this continuous conflict, this continuously escalating conflict with the federal government. Because the people of the United States, or at least the people in the eastern United States, did not want to be in a country, right, in which there were these religious fanatics that were living out in the western United States practicing plural marriage. It was seen as being debauched, immoral, lewd, bordering on prostitution. It was also seen, crucially, as being Oriental. The Mormons were behaving the way that Muslims, the Turks behaved. They were behaving the way that Chinese people behave. That is, in uncivilized ways. And it was the purpose or the responsibility of the federal government to protect civilization. Okay? And that's why you see the linking in that cartoon of the Mormons with the Chinese. Okay, so this resulted in the 1880s in particular, which is the most intense period of federal action against the Mormons. It's something that's called the raid. So initially this is justified as protecting the Mormon women in Utah from the octopus of the Mormon church. So that's the octopus getting all of the women. So that actually kind of falls away as a justification, because what they find out actually is that the Mormons weren't kidnapping women and forcing them to be polygamists, is that the women were voluntarily entering into this. It didn't So that's when the rhetoric about the Orientalness and the lack of civilization of the Mormons is sort of cranked up. And on the other side, you see this is a reward. Two people here for whom a reward is being offered is John Taylor, who's the president of the Mormon Church at the time, and then George Buchanan, who would have been the most nationally prominent Mormon at the time. He was one of Taylor's counselors and had actually been a delegate to Congress. And there's an $800 reward for their apprehension. Okay, so the federal government's main strategy in dealing with Mormons was simply to arrest and incarcerate as many Latter-day Saints as they possibly could for violating anti-polygamy laws. But they also wanted to restrict Latter-day Saint immigration into the United States. So, beginning in the 1830s, the Mormons sent missionaries abroad, particularly to the United Kingdom and into Scandinavia. They proved very, very successful, particularly among the urban poor, in the sort of rapidly industrializing cities of the Midlands in England, and then among the rural poor in Scandinavia. With the result is there are thousands of converts to Mormonism from Europe. These converts want to gather, is the term that they would use, they want to gather to the United States where they can live in the Mormon communities in the United States. And to give you some sense of the scale of these missionary efforts, in 1844, when Joseph Smith, the founder of the religion, is murdered, it's estimated there were actually more Latter-day Saints living in Great Britain than were living in the United States. Okay? So what does the federal government do? The first thing they do is they try to attack Mormon immigration at the source. So on the left, we have James Buchanan, who until recently was regarded as the worst president in American history. He was president from 1856 to 1860, which is when the United States tears itself apart during the Civil War. Prior to becoming president, he was the American ambassador to the court of St. James, and as president, he lobbied the foreign secretary of Great Britain to keep your Mormons at home. So wanted the British government to restrict Mormon immigration from the United Kingdom. The man on the right is William Evarts. William Evarts is actually a pretty interesting guy. He was on the stand when Abraham Lincoln delivered the Gettysburg Address. He gave a really long speech before the Gettysburg Address that nobody pays any attention to now. Since it's impeachment time in the United States, when Andrew Johnson, as president, was impeached, William Evarts was his lawyer in front of the United States Senate who represented him. He eventually became Secretary of State in the Hayes administration, where he pursued the same policy that Buchanan had pursued. So he sent a circular letter to all of the embassies and consulates of the United States in Europe, and encouraged them to pressure domestic governments to restrict emigration of Mormon converts to the United States. He said it was very important to keep the United States from, quote, becoming a resort or a refuge for crowds of misguided men and women, and that the bands and organizations of Latter-day Saints, which are got together in foreign lands as recruits, cannot be regarded as otherwise than a deliberate and systematic attempt to bring a person to the United States with the intent of violating their laws and committing crimes expressly punishable under a statute as a penitentiary offense. Evarts' lobbying efforts proved to be not very successful. The British government is not particularly interested in restricting the immigration of Latter-day Saints. There are some governments in Europe that do make efforts at restriction. The Danish government, certain German governments restrict Mormon immigration. But that effort to cut off Mormon immigration at the source proves not very successful. You'll notice, right, what they're not doing is passing a law. The reason they're not passing a law is because they didn't think they had the constitutional authority at the time to pass a law that just out and out restricted Mormon immigration. So the next thing they tried to do was exclude Mormons from the United States upon arrival. So the Mormons organized, highly disciplined immigrant companies that would come to the United States as large groups. They would charter whole ships to bring the immigrants over in bulk as a way of keeping costs down. And then they would land on American territory, and you'd have to go through customs. And the authority, the legal authority that the customs officials had with regards to immigrants was not particularly well established, and they exercised a great deal of discretion. So what would they do? With some immigrant trains, if you got the wrong customs official, the customs official would just say, you can't land in the United States. We won't let you off the boat. Turn around and go back to England. Okay? In other cases, what would happen is the immigrant company would land in the United States and then would be immediately arrested by federal officials and would be held in jail. Basically, the idea was, we're going to hold you in jail and we'll let you out of jail, but only if you promise to get back on the boat and return to Europe. Okay? Interestingly, the Mormons actually were successful in some of those cases getting relief from the courts. So there was a band of Mormon immigrants that were incarcerated by customs officials in New York Harbor. They sued in local municipal court in New York for writ of habeas corpus, and the New York judge actually said to the customs officials, you don't have the authority to keep these people, you have to release them. The last thing that happened, and this happened in my home state of Virginia when Mormons landed in Norfolk, the Mormons were taken into custody by federal officials, at which point in time, Protestant missionaries were invited to come, right, and preach to them, to preach to this captive audience of Mormons, to convince them of the errors of their ways and the need for them to become Presbyterians, with the imprimatur of the federal officials that were keeping them in custody while the Protestants preached to them. The final strategy that was taken was to cut off and confiscate the source of funding for Mormon immigration into the United States. So, in order to finance Mormon immigration, the Mormons created a corporation called the Perpetual Emigrating Fund. And the idea was that the fund was essentially what today we would call a microcredit institution. The fund would advance small loans to people, to Latter-day Saints in Europe who wanted to travel to the United States to finance their trip to the United States. They would then come to the United States, and once they had arrived out in the Great Basin where the Mormons were settled, they would work to repay the loan. That money would go back into the fund, and then it would be reloaned to new immigration. So it's a revolving line, it's a revolving credit fund to fund Mormon immigration. In 1887, which is just about the time the Chinese Exclusion Act is being held constitutional by the U.S. Supreme Court, Congress passes a law called the Edmunds-Tucker Act. Among other things, the Edmunds-Tucker Act dissolves the Perpetual Immigration Fund, prohibits the territory of Utah from creating any other corporation that has a similar purpose to bring people to the United States, and confiscates all of their money. So all of the assets of the Perpetual Immigration Fund were sheeted to the United States government. So this is part of the broader policy of pressuring the Mormons to abandon plural marriage. And by the time of 1887, when the Perpetual Immigration Fund is dissolved and its assets confiscated, the level of legal pressure has gone very, very high. So hundreds of Mormons have been incarcerated for violating anti-bigamy statutes. Mormon women who had been granted the right to vote under territorial legislation. Actually, in the United States, Utah is the first place where women ever cast a vote. The right of women to vote in Utah is revoked by Congress. All Mormon polygamists are disenfranchised by act of Congress. In the neighboring territory from Utah of Idaho, the territorial legislature passed a law that simply disenfranchised all Mormons. That was upheld by the U.S. Supreme Court in a case called Davis versus Beeson. The Mormon Church as a legal entity was dissolved, and all of its property above a certain minimum was confiscated, including all of the Mormon temples, which were the sort of holiest sites for their religion. All of those temples were escheated to the United States government. So in 1890, facing permanent political subjugation, institutional annihilation, and mass incarceration, the Mormon Church, the president of the Mormon Church issues what's called the Manifesto, in which the church publicly abandons the practice of plural marriage. And then, as I mentioned before, it takes about 14 years to really completely abandon. Okay. So, what are the lessons, if you will, from this experience? So the first is that President Trump's actions in targeting immigrants on the basis of religion are not new. targeting immigrants on the basis of religion is actually not uncommon and has happened before in American history, in United States history. Secondly, religion is actually a poor proxy for crime. So the stated justification for the United States in trying to exclude Mormon immigrants was they're going to come to the United States and violate the polygamy laws, the anti-polygamy laws. And the federal officials seemed to assume that what was happening was that Mormon missionaries were going over to Europe and were getting uneducated young women and using perhaps mesmeric powers on them, and sort of almost kidnapping them to bring them to Utah to feed them into the harems of Mormon patriarchs. Okay, so for example, something like this story appears in A Study in Scarlet, which is the first Sherlock Holmes story. So this is a fiction. This is actually not what was happening. Most of these immigrants were immigrating as families. There are almost no single women that were immigrating. The families were overwhelmingly monogamous. It's difficult to figure out how widespread the practice of plural marriage was among 19th century Mormons, but the upper limit is about 20% of the Mormon population would have been participating in some way in a polygamous household, which means the vast majority of Latter-day Saints were actually monogamous. They weren't practicing polygamy. And if you think about Islam as a proxy for terrorism, it becomes even more ridiculous. At least 20% of the Latter-day Saints were, in fact, involved in some way in polygamy. It doesn't mean they were necessarily violating the anti-polygamy law, but they were involved in polygamous households. There are hundreds of millions, over 1 billion Muslims on planet Earth, and a vanishingly tiny proportion of them are involved in any way, shape, or form in terrorist activity. So as a law enforcement mechanism, using religion as a proxy is simply stupid law enforcement. Another lesson from this is that the executive is just as prone as the legislature to engage in discrimination. So in the birth of immigration law in the United States, the legislature engaged in essentially racial discrimination against the Chinese. The executive engaged in religious discrimination. There's no particular reason that we ought to trust the executive over the legislature. And this is important because ultimately the reason the Supreme Court upheld the actions of President Trump was not because the Supreme Court ruled that it was all right for him to discriminate on the basis of religion. The Supreme Court actually never even reached the question of whether or not the travel ban discriminated on the basis of religion. Rather, applying actually fairly well-established principles of law, the court simply held that in the immigration context, the president had massive discretion over admitting people into the United States. And so the Supreme Court could not inquire into the legality of his actions. The final is that negative effects of targeting religion can linger in our culture for a very long time. So there was a content study done of the treatment of Latter-day Saints in the popular press in the United States. And what that found is that well into the 20th century, the dominant image of Latter-day Saints, right, was as lascivious lascivious patriarchs who are in the thrall of their hierarchy that's exercising these sort of quasi-mesmeric powers over these mindless zombies, right? Which was very much the rhetoric of the raid of the 1880s. So that image is lingering in the popular imagination in the United States into the 1920s. So for at least a generation after the end of all this legal conflict, that's the dominant approach. I do want to end on a somewhat more hopeful note. And that is that memory matters, and remembering what's happened to people in the past can matter. So the gentleman on the left here is Gary Herbert. Gary Herbert is the Republican governor of the state of Utah. He's currently the longest-serving governor in the United States. Utah is one of the most Republican states in the United States. So you think that Gary Herbert and his constituents would be big fans of Donald Trump. And to be honest, a fair number of his constituents are big fans of Donald Trump, unfortunately. But Gary Herbert's also a Latter-day Saint, and about 70% of his constituents are Latter-day Saints. So Donald Trump recently sent a circular letter to all of the governors of the various states and said, hey, send me suggestions on what you think we should do to change federal policy based on your experience as a state executive. And just a few weeks ago, Gary Herbert sent a letter back to Donald Trump. And what he noted was that as a result of federal policy, the number of refugees that was settling in the state of Utah was down. So this is what Governor Herbert wrote in his letter. Utah's unique history informs our approach to refugees. Our state was founded by religious refugees fleeing persecution in the eastern United States. Those experiences and hardships in our pioneer ancestors 170 years ago are still fresh in the minds of many Utahns. As a result, we empathize deeply with individuals and groups who have been forced from their homes, and we love giving them a new home and a new way of life. And as it turns out, we do it quite well. Those refugees who resettle in Utah become integrated and accepted into our communities. They become productive employees and responsible citizens. They become contributors in our schools, churches, and other civic associations, even helping to serve more recent refugees and thus generating a beautiful cycle of charity. And hopefully that is a hopeful message for the power of remembering some of these often ugly stories.
Thank you so much, Professor Oman. Our next speaker will be Professor Morton Weinfeld. He's a professor of sociology at McGill, where he holds the chair in Canadian ethnic studies. He began teaching at McGill following his doctorate from Harvard in 1977. He's published 10 books and many articles dealing with Canadian ethnic studies and Canadian Jewish studies. He has also advised federal and provincial governments on issues of immigration, multiculturalism, and racism. His most recent book is Like Everyone Else, But Different: The Paradoxical Success of Canadian Jews. Professor Weinfeld will be talking to us about giving a lecture entitled Suspect Minorities in Canada. Professor Weinfeld.
Thank you, Dr. Jarvis. I have to apologize for two things. First, I'm fighting a cold, as you can hear, so you'll have to bear with me for that. Secondly, I do not have a PowerPoint. So I hope the talk will somehow make up for that lack. So, suspect minorities in Canada. I teach a course with that title at McGill. In fact, one of my students is sitting there in the back, and so if I make a mistake, correct me if that happens. Suspect minority in Canada. What is that about? It's not a pure ethnic and racial course, racism in Canada, but it has to do with the idea of minorities being suspect. Sometimes they can be suspect for national security reasons, alleged national security reasons, and sometimes they can be suspect for having the wrong set of values. And in a sense, recently Islamophobia comes to the fore as an example of those kinds of reasons why a certain group is labeled as suspect. So what I'm going to talk to you today about is the idea of suspect minorities and a little bit about dual loyalties in an age of diasporic profusion. Because diasporas are more and more common, more and more active for all sorts of technological reasons, and certainly in Canada. So, what are the options for minority groups that find themselves under suspicion? And secondly, once a minority group has been victimized, like for example the Japanese in World War II, how do they respond to that? What are their options to respond to their plight? So I put forward kind of two paradigms. Now the title of this overarching series of 4 lectures is very interesting, from hate to tolerance. And that's a very powerful message, right? From hate to progress to tolerance. I'm no lawyer, but from a legal perspective, tolerance may not be enough, because then we want to proceed from tolerance to rights and to equality. And there's a long literature of political philosophy about the difference between all of that. So, one of the options available to a minority in the face of mistreatment is what you call a tolerance paradigm, trying to regain favor from the majority group that is victimized. Tolerance, something that was admired by John Locke, certainly was found as the only game in town for minorities in Canada right through the 50s and 60s. You know, people say, you know, why didn't the Canadian Jews demonstrate more in the 1930s to try to get the doors open in Canada? And the answer is they couldn't. There was no discourse, there was no mechanism, there was no way for them to conceive of doing that in the 1930s. So you fell back on a tolerance paradigm. The other paradigm that we have, and that now supersedes in most discourse, whether it's law or sociology or whatever you want, is kind of a rights-based paradigm, where you emphasize agency of minority groups. We're not going to take this anymore. We don't have to prove anything. We are citizens. We want equal rights. We will fight for those rights. If we have to, we'll go on the streets and demonstrate and march. We have to, we'll go to court and sue your pants off. But we will do something. We won't take it. So that's kind of a rights paradigm. Of course, in Canada, we have the Charter, which crystallizes the rights paradigm. The emergence of the rights paradigm is interesting. The Holocaust played a role in the sense of minorities having to resist. The civil rights movement in the United States plays a major role. The anti-colonial movements in the post-war period against imperialist powers plays a role. And anthropology plays a role too, in the sense of cultural relativism emerging, and that you know, as a way to say, no, you know, the Eurocentric approach to things is not the only way to look at life and civilization. So, let's look at some of the World War II cases in Canada to start this, and then we'll try to give you 5 minutes more. Okay? So, as you know, World War II breaks out. Italian Canadians, German Canadians, and of course Japanese Canadians are excluded. The Italian Canadians, about 700 of them are rounded up as alleged fascists, sent to camp, Petawawa, and this is a very traumatic event for Canadian Italians. To tell the truth, in the 1930s, the Canadian-Italian community was overwhelmingly pro-Muslim. In the 1930s, being pro-Mussolini or even pro-fascist did not mean the same thing we think it is today, because it was all done in juxtaposition with Bolshevism. So you had to choose between two evils, so you went with Mussolini. After the war, what did the Italian Canadians do in the 40s and 50s to try to resurrect their reputation? So I wrote an article, co-wrote an article on that topic, and I quoted one of the leaders of the Italian Canadian community who said, we had to prove we were good Canadians. So that's what they did. They proved they were good Canadians, they integrated, they worked hard, and they put to rest the fascist label. The Japanese case is interesting. It's more poignant. I'm not going to go over the details. I presume everyone here knows the details of the Japanese case. So, the Japanese are dispossessed horribly. There's no mass resistance on the part of the Japanese Canadians to do that. There's no mass mobilization of white Canadians to help the Japanese. Excuse me. So, the war's over. And 4,500 Japanese Canadians expelled. What did the Japanese Canadians do? Not much. Organization. Keep quiet. Work hard. Intermarriage rates go up on the West Coast. Japanese Canadian educational attainment starts to go up. The generation of World War II dies out. The next generation gets older, and it's finally the 1980s that the Japanese Canadian community mobilizes and says, you know what, we were victimized back. We want some justice. And they get it in a form from the World War. In the 1980s, there's a settlement with the Japanese Canadians, $20,000 for each survivor, a formal apology. vigorous, militant, never again type paradigm. So, the first question, and I'm not going to give you conclusions in this talk, but I'm going to pose questions, maybe it will help in the Q&A. So, the first question to pose is, when minorities are victimized today, well, we have the Charter of Rights and Freedom, and we have a discourse of civil rights. And we've learned some of the lessons in the past. Should there be any space for that old-fashioned tolerance paradigm, which is kind of weak and obsequious? Or do we put all the eggs in the more militant, more agentic, rights paradigm, more assertive, more demanding? What's the link between these two? Tactically, strategically, on the part of minorities. It's an interesting question because nowadays I think there are very few people who have much good to say about that old-fashioned tolerance paradigm. So, that's a question to raise. And in the Italian and Japanese cases, you see the sequential role of these paradigms. And of course, the nasty thing to say is, in both cases, they were successful. In a complete reintegration of the Japanese and the Italians after the horrific World War II experience into the mainstream fabric of Canadian society. And there are many other reasons for that reintegration. The Cold War played a big role, and so we can't go into all of them. Geopolitics played. So, is there a role for that? Now, this question, so that's the first question I want to pose, is of course very acute for the Jewish community. Right? I mean, the Holocaust, if it has a lesson at all, the lesson is never again. Never again in Europe, never again being quiet in North America to demand action, right? That's the lesson of the Holocaust. Never again. And it makes a lot of sense. But I guess the question that we want to pose is, when you have a sophisticated polity like the Canadian Jewish, and this, by the way, goes on all the time in the Canadian Jewish community at its political levels, but also in other minority communities, which is when to be tough and when to be less tough, when to be accommodating and when to be less accommodating. How to navigate these political wills as a minority. But that in itself, the fact that minority groups pose these questions is an illustration of the agency that they have now acquired, because they are plotting a strategy. They are plotting a way forward in the political sphere. The Jews have always been suspect. That's one of the reasons it's interesting to study the Jewish group. They have always been suspect, and they, of course, have always been primarily, for at least for 3,000 years, but they've had 2,000 years at the diaspora community, right? So, what are the lessons of the Jewish experience in the question that I just posed? The idea of Jews as suspects, I know there was a lecture on the Jewish question a while ago, but I don't know if they're covering this ground. The idea of Jews as suspects goes back to the very first statement of anti-Semitism that we have on record. Well, why did Pharaoh enslave the Jews? It's not because they worshiped the wrong God. It's not because they were racially inferior. It's because Pharaoh was worried that the Jews would multiply and join their neighbors and conspire against us. They would become, they call them suspect members. They could not be trusted. So that's the first recorded instant of anti-Semitism that we have. Right? And that carries through the entire Jewish experience. Can't go into it now, but the notion of Jewish conspiracy is rooted in that notion. The Protocols of the Elder Society is rooted in this notion that Jews have this dual loyalty, and they cannot be trusted, and they're always going to be working against the interests of whatever country that they are in. Now this problem with dual loyalty, and now I'm going to segue more into the issue of dual loyalty, also goes back quite some time. Napoleon in 1806 convened a gathering of 100 nobles, Jewish nobles, to pose some questions to them to see if it was a good idea to integrate these Jews into French society. So he asked them 3 questions. And one of the questions was, would the Jews be bound to fight and defend France in case of war? Would you fight for France? There were other questions too. These 100 Jewish notables, of course, were very clever, very smart. They knew what the French wanted to hear. They knew what Napoleon wanted to hear. And of course they said, of course we'll fight and die for France. Of course we will do that. The fact is they were right. And we know they were right from the record of World War I. The record of World War I is clear that the Jews of France fought and died for France. The Jews of Germany fought and died for Germany. The Jews of Italy fought and died for Italy. The Jews of England fought and died for England. And the Jews of Germany, go back, the Jews of Germany loved Germany. It was a passionate love affair between German Jews and Germany. Germany was the center of culture, and the German Jews were part. And that's true. In terms of civilization, Germany in the 1910s and 20s was it. Right? So, dual loyalty. So the Jews have always been wrestling with this concern for dual loyalty. And it is something now, very, very clearly, that the Muslim community wrestles with. And both from a national security point of view, and also from an ethical civilizational point of view, similar to Mormons in some ways, you know. This is a strange, alien force that may threaten the foundations of our society. There have been some studies that have compared anti-Semitism against Jews in the 1910 era with Islamophobia today. Back in the pre-World War I era, Jews had 2 big problems. They were the iconic other. The iconic other for 2 reasons. One is they had this strange religion. They were Christian. They were Jews with a long history of anti-Judaism. Can't go into now. They had this value system that was strange. They spoke this strange language, Yiddish and all this stuff. It was just very strange, very other. They were also in large numbers, not majority, in large numbers. They were socialists, they were communists, they were anarchists, they were fellow travelers. They were sympathetic to the left. So if you were the powers on the right, you were worried about the Jews. Similar sort of thing facing Muslims today. Muslims today, first, are seen as a kind of national security threat. They are sympathetic to, they may be, they harbor, they are okay with terrorism. Right? That's the threat. The same way the Jews were going to, destabilize the West. And, of course, the Muslims have a strange civilization, strange other culture. Right? It's not Judeo-Christian. We call it Abrahamic, try to paper that over, but in terms of the discourse of those who want to oppress Muslims, this is a strange polygamy. Right? It's a foundational threat. It's a foundational threat. We live in an age of diasporic explosion. What does that mean? That means that all of the immigrant groups that have come to Canada today are able, if they desire, to retain a contact with their home countries that is much more intense than it was 100 years ago. This is travel back and forth, this is telephone, this is computer, this is FaceTime, this is getting a satellite dish so that you can watch in real time the soccer game from your home country. You never left. And you can live in your own little cocoon if you want, and we see this. It's not, this does happen. Not for everyone, but for large numbers of these individuals. So this is a kind of dual loyalty. What do we think of dual loyalty in Canada? How comfortable are we with dual citizenship? You know that some recent politicians in Canada have to renounce their citizenship. We can't have dual citizenship. found that, Senator Cruz found that out when they found Mike Canadian, the river, who birthed this horrible tragedy. So, how do we feel about dual loyalty? So I sometimes tell my students, there is no problem with dual loyalty. Imagine a group like the Fredonians. I made that up. The Fredonians, they listen, in their household, they do what they want. They listen to Fredonian music, they eat Fredonian food, they hang out with other Fredonians, they can speak Fredonian, they can visit Fredonian. There's no problem with having dual loyalties. In Canada, there is no problem until there is a problem. And then there's a problem. Then there's a problem. And even if you read the papers today, you see inklings of this problem. You know, the Indian community in Canada versus the Pakistani community in Canada have real disagreements. The Jewish community, Arab communities have disagreements. There are many examples. Chinese Canadians now are sometimes caught with what's going on in China, Canada's posture to that, where do they fit in, Hong Kong, what's the proper status, what's the proper response? So, I would argue that dual loyalties exist. Most of the time, they are not a problem. You don't have to renounce your citizenship. But every once in a while, they will be problematic. So, I want to pose two questions to the group. Rather than offer an answer, I'd just like to hear what the group has to say. So the first one I asked earlier, is there a space, should there a space be in a liberal democratic society like Canada today for that old-fashioned tolerance paradigm in terms of guiding minority group responses to threat and to discrimination? The second question, I think is worth talking, it has to do with dual loyalty. What do we really think about that, and what advice would we give to our leaders, to our opinion shapers, about how we respond to this increasing diversity that we see in Canada? We in Canada have celebrated multiculturalism for a long time. And a lot of Canadian academics, people I know well, hang out with, make fun of that. They say, oh, it's not real celebration of diversity, it's just food. They call it saris and samosas. That's what the literature calls it. You know, something you eat, something you wear. It's not real multiculturalism. That's very common in my field, I gotta tell you. Food is unimportant. I tell my students food is very important. Sometimes I try to persuade them that that's actually important in terms of identity and culture. So I'll end with a little anecdote about Canadian multiculturalism to see if that offers any guidance to this second question, is what we do with these dual loyalties, which exist. 3 years ago, I gave a talk at the University of Texas in Austin about Canadian multiculturalism to a group of 20 academics around the table. And I began my talk, then I had a PowerPoint, with that famous photograph that we've all seen of Justin Trudeau at the airport, welcoming the Syrian refugee families. Remember when they came in large numbers, and he was there, bending down, hugging these kids who grew up members, of course. So I showed that photo, and this was a group of 20, 25, experienced, knowledgeable academics who knew what was going on in the world. And what was their response when I showed that photo? Silence. 5 seconds. They were stunned. They all hadn't seen that photo, or maybe one or two had, because they were just living the experience of Donald Trump and what he had done. And they were comparing Canada to the United States. And Canada came out very well. I don't want to be a cheerleader for Canada in that regard. But we live in a world in which we often compare ourselves to some other entity to try to make sense of where we are. So, that would be the second question. What do we think about these dual loyalties? They exist. Are they a problem? Should we worry about them? Should we not? How do we want to navigate with that? So I think I'll end with those two questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Weinfeld and Professor Oman, for your talks and lectures and all the ideas you presented to us. So we have some time, about 40 minutes, I guess, for question and answers. Feel free, you can respond to Professor Weinfeld's questions. You can ask your own questions of either one of the speakers. I'd like to ask you to keep the questions brief. We don't want to have very lengthy commentary. We give everybody a chance to participate. So maybe start with the back.
Thank you very much. My question would be for the second speaker. You talked about the integration of different communities, but I think I remember that the Italians had quite important problems in Quebec in the 60s. And I think, in my opinion, this is a more obvious reason for their integration into the Canadian general society than their own participation. I think, just to put it clearly, they were identified as Anglos in the linguistic fight in Quebec, and so they integrated better because they were then defined as member of the group by a minority, national minority in Canada. So I would disagree on that. But concerning another group, you didn't explain how the Jewish community did. Because you said that the Holocaust created some kind of trauma and that they had the proper response to it, but you didn't elaborate on what they did and how they did to achieve which they achieved. So thank you.
Thanks for the question. So on the Italian experience, you're focusing on Quebec rather than all of Canada. In the 1960s, there was the St. Leonard crisis, as you may know, and there was the question of its education for the Italian community. And that was a problem for the Italian community, but also a problem for many other immigrant communities in Quebec. I would say that from what I know of the evidence of Italian integration, it is quite strong in Canada, all over Canada. In Quebec, I don't have the exact details. I guess it's a question of what you want to measure. I would certainly say that even in Quebec, the Italian community integrates as well as any other minority community in Quebec. But there still is a strong support for Italianità, for Italian identity, culture, and language. As you know, there's a famous church on the Jean Talon where you can still see the statue of Mussolini on his horse, right? So, and no one's taking that down anytime soon. So, not like Robert E. Lee or anything like that. That's staying right there. On that score, I would say, we can discuss that later, maybe over a coffee if there's time. I would say that I quoted, in my study, I quoted some leaders of the Italian community in the 50s. And their view was, we have to show we are good Canadians. And they did that. Now, that means they didn't, now that there was a demand 30 years later for reparations and a formal apology, but that came later. And it wasn't as powerful as the Japanese demand. On the Jewish case in the Holocaust, I don't quite understand the question. I mean, the Holocaust plays a major role in contemporary Jewish identity, like major role. And we know this from surveys where Jews in Canada and the United States have been asked, what is essential to being a Jew? And the number one item that is listed as to what is essential to being a Jewish person in Canada and the United States in separate surveys is remembering the Holocaust. Now, that may be a silly answer, but that doesn't matter. That's what people feel. So, but clearly, Jews have been successful in many places. When I feel cynical, I say, well, 2,000 years of experience as a majority diaspora community, you pick up some things along the way. You learn how to navigate very nasty situations, but you also learn how to make the best of certain situations as well. And, you know, don't forget the possibly the most important religious text in the Jewish tradition is the Talmud, not the Torah. And that was a product of the Babylonian diaspora and exile. So, you know, you learn to do what you can after 2,000 years. That's all.
But how would you explain the Holocaust then?
How I explain the Holocaust?
That if 2,000 years end up with the success because of experience, you would have to explain the Holocaust. My question is, how did the Jewish community succeeded after the experience they had?
Well, first of all, the Jewish community succeeded, to use your term, after the Roman expulsion 2,000 years ago. They succeeded after the Spanish Inquisition, and the expulsion from Spain and Portugal was a horrific trauma for the Jewish community. So, you know, that's how they managed to do that. We can discuss that later.
Another question? Here in the front.
This one would be about the laws in America. It's a great thing to bring in immigrants and all others, including Muslims, but to help the Americans appreciate people from the Muslim community, they might want to help by giving, for example, Sharia law, which covers the minorities, more vulnerable people in the Muslim community. So, are we doing things to suppress Sharia law coming out?
Question, do you know what Sharia law is?
Just part of it.
I'm just saying that it's a word that people use a lot, and people often don't know exactly what it means.
Hey, I'm sorry, can we just stop the, interjecting, try and maintain a level of respect for everyone in the room, okay?
In the United States, it's been a live issue where people...
We didn't hear the question. We didn't summarize the question.
Oh, yeah, so the question is, as Muslims have been coming into, if I'm understanding the question correctly, as Muslims have been coming increasingly into the United States and other countries, there have been claims about the authority or validity of Sharia law that makes a lot of people uncomfortable, and how does the legal system deal with that? The answer in the United States is that there has been some concern about this. I think almost every single one of the individual cases that you look at, which have been trotted out as examples of American courts applying Sharia law, they end up being very, very banal situations. So it's something like there's a construction contract of an American company in Saudi Arabia that's governed by Saudi law, and so therefore a particular interpretation of Islamic contract law dealing with interest governs the contract, and that gets decided by the federal court. So this is not the stuff of which the collapse of liberal society is made. I do think that there's an enormous amount of demagoguery around the issue of Sharia law. In the United States, you can see that, for example, a number of states have passed anti-Sharia law statutes, which are solutions to a problem that does not exist and are probably unconstitutional under current American law. It turns out that all legal systems struggle with the question of applying the law of other legal systems. It's actually quite common for a court to find itself judging a dispute where the substantive law that governs the dispute is a law different than the jurisdiction of the court. And we actually have a whole class in law school on this. It's called conflicts of law. And actually, courts have developed a long, complicated body of rules in conflict that's basically designed to say that we're going to show respect to the laws of other jurisdictions and other people, but we're not going to do it if we think the results are really extreme or crazy. That's the technical legal summary of that body of doctrine. And I actually think that this is not a problem, because conflicts, we've been dealing with this for a long time in common law legal systems. And we were dealing with crazy French law and crazy Danish law and crazy German law. And there are very well-established solutions to anything that might be a problem.
mentioned about the application of laws reminds me of something I recall, a 17th century case of an Amsterdam court applying Jewish law in the case of remittance of a dowry. That just came to mind. I was wondering, can you think of any earlier examples? The second question I have has to do with the social integration, and I want to bring the example of the Kulturbund in Germany. I think that's a fantastic example. You have 4 elements to integration. You have political, social, economics, very important, and cultural. And these come together to make a very interesting recipe. The Kulturbund was an example where dual nationality was beneficial. You took the best of both worlds. I see a little bit of that happening in communities in Canada. I was wondering whether either of you could comment on this aspect of social integration, this being the solution, but in Germany, I think someone mentioned that brought the downfall of the Jews. That's true. They were too integrated, and that made them, unfortunately, a target of discrimination because of their omnipresence in the urban milieu. So please comment. Thank you.
I have no expertise at all on 17th century Dutch law, so I will defer to your statement on that.
Any other precedents? Any earlier examples of application of?
Yes. I mean, so there are examples going all the way back to Roman law. For example, in the context of Jews, where Roman law would validate the decisions of sort of local religious tribunals, and so at least in the Western legal tradition, there's a deep tradition of legal pluralism, of there being overlapping legal systems that apply to people, and then sort of trying to sort out the kinds of conflicts that arise in that. But that goes back as far as you can go back with law in the West at any rate as an intellectual discipline.
Which religions were involved in this role?
Those are the ones I know about are Jewish, but the Romans tended to let other religious training involved as well.
Thank you.
I'm also not an expert on Dutch law of the 17th century. But you know, these issues are with us. The Canadian Charter, for example, has not resolved any of these issues. This is work for judges for a long time. You may be familiar with the famous Sukkah case in Canada. For those who are not, very quickly, a sukkah is a hut that religious Jews build for 8 days in the fall, and there was a famous case of the sanctuary, which is a fancy condo building here, and there was a Jewish person there, and he wanted to have this wooden hut on his balcony. But it turns out that when he signed the condo lease in this fancy, posh condo building, there was a section that said, you can't put anything like that on your balcony. So he had a problem, so he went to court. And he said, you know, he was suffering discrimination based on religion, that he could not do this. But what did the Canadian, and went all the way up to the Supreme Court. And what happened in this case, I tell this to my students, and actually in a way it's very surreal and hilarious. Woody Allen could do a film about this. So you have 2 rabbis in front of the Canadian court, expert witnesses, arguing. One said, this guy needs to have his own sukkah on his own balcony. And another rabbi said, no, he can go to the synagogue 2 blocks down and he can use their sukkah, so he doesn't have to have his own on the balcony. And what's hilarious, and then you have this non-Jewish judge who has to make sense out of all of these debates, right? You can't come up with a funnier script than that. But the Canadian courts, they came up with a decision that was the best and worst of both worlds. And it's the only decision they could have come up with. Some of you may know. They said, look, it doesn't matter which of these 2 rabbis is correct. Thank God they didn't enter that debate. Can you imagine where that leads you? The slippery slope where you know, what is halal meat? You know, and you get these 2 Christian judges trying to, anyway. So the point is, but what the court said is, what really matters is whether that individual had a sincerely held conviction that he had to have that sukkah. If he had a sincerely held religious belief, rightly or wrongly, then that is something that the courts would defer to. I think that's problematic. On the other hand, I think any solution would be problematic. But, you know, so even our legal system has to wrestle with these odd religious systems. As, you know, in terms of Sharia law in Canada, you know that in 2005 this was debated in Ontario, and it was eventually decided against it. I should point out that the Muslim community in Canada was sharply divided. The Muslim community in Canada was very sharply divided on whether this was a good idea or not. And because many liberal Muslims did not want that. So, that's what I'm going to say.
In the back. Okay. This is directed to the first speaker. You carried us through a timeline, Mormons integrating, shall we say, in the American fabric up until the 1920s. And then you mentioned the governor of the state of Utah, at present day, I suppose. Could you fill us in as to what happened, let's say, in that period of 1920 to present day time? Unless I missed out on something. Just a capsule.
Okay, so the question is, well, what happened to the Mormons, say, between 1904 and 2009? So a lot of stuff happened. In American society, what happens is the Mormons try to, and are largely successful as rebranding themselves as the most American of possible Americans that there could be among all Americans. And they bend over backwards to try to be the most stereotypical American you can possibly be. Which, if you had told that to a Mormon living in Utah in the 1880s, or a non-Mormon American living in Washington, D.C. in the 1880s, it would have sounded like the most bizarre thing ever to have happened. And the Mormons were largely successful in that process. There were some good things and some bad things about that process of assimilation. I think the worst of the bad things that happened is the Mormons decided to become the most American of Americans you could be of Americans basically the first 2 decades of the 20th century, which is the high watermark of Jim Crow thinking in the United States. And Mormons take on board those racial attitudes. They develop some kind of complicated and ultimately hokey theology to try and undermine this. And I think a lot of that process was about we're trying to be super American, and being super American in 1920 means being really white and not being black. And I think that has some really unfortunate effects, especially for African American Latter-day Saints, of whom there were some at that time. The upside of that process is that I think that they take on a lot of some of the sort of best bits and pieces of mid-20th century Americana. They tend to be very hardworking. They have successful and stable monogamous families, which again would have sort of shocked people of the 1880s that Mormons become the poster boys and girls for the traditional family. And the interesting thing that's happened, right, is you see shifts in social attitudes over, say, the last generation. This persona that Mormons crafted for themselves as the most American of apple pie Americans becomes sort of, looks kind of threatening and reactionary. So this identity that was crafted as a sort of defensive identity in response to massive levels of legal coercion directed at Latter-day Saints, and they want to make themselves into as small a target as they possibly can. Increasingly, they kind of look retrograde and weird, and that probably that kind of mid-20th century model is breaking down. And I think one of the big questions or debates within the Mormon community now is, how is it that you come up with a new identity that keeps you as a fairly small target? But I do think, like, deep in their DNA, there's a kind of defensive crouch that Latter-day Saints that is just the lingering effect of that 19th century experience in his memory and its care.
Won't go away.
And I doubt it will ever go away.
I have two questions for the second speaker. First one is, can you clarify what the dual loyalty type means? And the second question is, does dual citizenship necessarily generate dual loyalty? And if not, what's the connection?
I didn't hear the second question. Did you repeat it?
Does dual citizenship necessarily generate dual loyalty? And if not, what's the connection?
What was the first part of the second thing?
You wanted a clarification on dual loyalty
Yes, I got that.
and then dual citizenship and its connection.
Oh, dual citizenship. Okay, so what is dual loyalty? I mean, look, every immigrant comes here with some kind of dual loyalty, dual identity, call it whatever term you want. They have one foot in the old country, if they're adult immigrants, and one foot in the new country. That is not a tragedy. That is life. It's not a tragedy. It's not a failing of Canada. It's not a failing of the old country. It's nothing. Now, a lot of immigrants come and their loyalties remain strong. Now they can be much stronger. 110 years ago, if you were an immigrant, you took a 10-day boat ride, and you either stayed in the United States, maybe you went back one time to visit the old country, or you couldn't hack it and you went back for good. There was a lot of return migration, 27% in one instance. So a lot of people went back, fine, others stayed, but we know that even back then they had ties to it. But what does ties mean? They would read the press, they would get newspaper reports from what's going on in the old country. The Irish, Italians, all sorts of people. There was a constant. It didn't just start in the 21st century. So that's dual identity, dual loyalty. I wrote an article about this, which I just presented to my class last week, about, I asked Canadian Jews, prominent Canadian Jews, the following hypothetical question. If there were a World Cup championship soccer match between Canada and Israel, who would you root for? Isn't that funny? Now, I tell the students right away, that will never happen in our lifetime. There will never be such a soccer final match between those countries. But, so I posed that question to some very, some of them were well-known Canadian Jewish personalities in various walks of life. And what was fascinating for me, I thought this was a funny question. People would enjoy chatting about it and all this. No. The vast majority were very upset that I posed that question. And they came up with the most convoluted kinds of reasons as to why they could not answer. Well, I would root for both. Or, I don't know enough about soccer. I know it goes on and on, so how do you interpret that? I would say that what's surprising is, these Jews were fairly well integrated in Canadian Jewish life. Some of them had a strong Jewish identity, some were less strong, but a clear one. Others were well known in Canadian circles in which they operated. But something was bothering them about that question, made them uneasy. So that's what tells me that even in a well-integrated group, those kinds of attachments can still linger. Is this very problematic? No, I don't think it's horribly problematic until it becomes problematic.
Lauren, Steinman, motion.
Yeah, well, for both of you, just bringing some things together, I think that this issue of dual loyalty seems to be coming up a lot in Trump's rhetoric, suggesting that you either have to be loyal to the presidency, or you are then, if you betray the presidency, you're then loyal to the laws of the U.S. Constitution, which is a very strange irony. But if you bring this question now to Dr. Weinfeld and Jewish identity,
mentioned Islamophobia. That's also rooted clearly in dual loyalty. Different cultural loyalty and different political, national security loyalty. In the Jewish case, that's always been there. It's part of the history of the Zionist movement, by the way. It didn't start recently. You know, and in fact, if you look at the literature on Zionism, which is why I think it's very relevant to other minority groups now, the early Zionists had tremendous and ferocious debates about how the Zionist movement would hurt their claims for loyalty and equal citizenship in good places like you know, England and France and Canada and the United States and that sort of thing. You know, how can we support Zionism if at last the Western liberal democracies have welcomed us? You know, and we will be tarred with dual loyalty. And there's a lot of books that were written about this and debates in the Zionist movement, 1910s, 1920s, 1930s. They were concerned about this. Not in Eastern Europe. Eastern Europe, they wanted to get the hell out of here. They wanted nothing to do with the Tsar. They weren't happy about you know, Stalin. Let's get the hell out. But in the West, this was a real problem. And well, and there were one attempt at the solution was after Israel was founded in 1948. There was a famous exchange of letters between Ben-Gurion, who was the prime minister of Israel, and a guy named Blaustein, who was the head of the American Jewish Community. Like a really major player in American Jewish. They had an exchange of letters. What was the exchange of letters about? It was about dual loyalty and about how to avoid the traps. So they sort of had an agreement in this exchange of letters where Ben-Gurion said, you know what? Well, here's what they agreed. Israel will not interfere in American Jewish life, and American Jews will not interfere in Israeli life. That did not last. Okay? But that was the theoretical, you know, let's keep things apart, let's keep things separate. But that didn't last. By the way, there are at least 70 countries in the world that have whole ministries devoted to the welfare of their diasporic communities all over the world and how they can work for the interests of the whole country. This is a universal problem. It's not just a problem in the Middle East. Countries are worried about this. The Indian government in India worries about how it can mobilize the Indian diaspora for its own purposes.
Perhaps Professor Oman commented on this dual loyalty concept in the Latter-day Saint experience.
Yeah, so the 19th century Latter-day Saints, one of the consistent tropes that was used against Latter-day Saints is that they are treasonous. And they are disloyal to the United States. Why are they disloyal to the United States? Because they claim that there is first-order loyalty to their church and to God and to their religious commitments. And that was seen as being politically threatening. And so one of the problems is how is it that in a country that ostensibly is supposed to be celebrating religious freedom and religious pluralism and the Pilgrim Fathers fleeing European tyranny for the New World, how is it that you deal with labeling this religious minority as treasonous because of their religious beliefs? And the way that rhetoric gets managed in the 19th century is to say that Mormonism isn't a religion. And so what is a religion is like basically Protestantism. And things that aren't Protestant aren't religion. So what are they? They're enthusiasm or their fanaticism or something like that. And that's a different category than religion. It's something like the way in which the term cult gets used now, right? So cult is something that allows me to define a religious group as something other than religious so that I can switch it. And it actually ends up in the law. So one of my favorites of this is there is a case, it's the big last case during the raid that ultimately prompts the Mormon Church to issue a manifesto publicly to sit down and plea me. It's a case called Late Corporation of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints against the United States. And that's the case where the Supreme Court upheld the federal law that disincorporates the Mormon Church and confiscates all their assets. And the court holds There were Canadian converts very early on. I found this actually a couple of weeks ago. I was traveling to London for a conference at the University of Western Ontario. And in Western Ontario, there is a road that's called Nauvoo Road. And Nauvoo is the name of the Mormon settlement in the 1840s that all the Mormons were gathering to. And it's called Nauvoo Road because that's the road that the Canadian Mormons took when they went to Illinois. And one assumes that was the most exciting thing that ever happened on that road. So there were immigrants. I think part of what was probably happening with the Canadian banditti point is the lingering effects of the War of 1812. So this is happening in the early 1830s, so it's only about 15, 20 years after the War of 1812. There would have been veterans from that war that would have still been alive, and that would have been part of the American imagination. And so they would have seen Canada, right, as this kind of looming British imperial threat to the north that might do that.
I was hoping we could have a small conversation about some of the issues that came out tonight in Bill 21, or Law 21, I would say. We talked about dual loyalties, and in fact Canada is based on dual loyalties in a way, French, Canadian, French, English. And we talked about multiculturalism, but it's an issue that's rejected by French Canadians. So I just wondered if you had any comments on the dual loyalty issue and Bill or Law 21.
Well, Quebecers see themselves as a minority. So every minority is very defensive and very worried about often worried about its survival, its strength, etc. And Quebec has survived in part because of kind of a vigilance against les autres, the others. There was resentment against the Anglo elite, and then the immigrants start coming, and they largely integrate into the English community when they come. So this is another problem. So very simply, unfortunately, Quebec did not have the immigrant integrating experience that the United States had and that English Canada had. This is a subject for a long lecture. Quebec only tries to begin the process of immigrant integration in the 1960s. That's when it begins. Whereas in the United States and Canada, for better or for worse, English Canada, it happens 2 generations earlier. And it's still not complete at all in Quebec. Quebec is still a very insecure place, which is why there are many other reasons, but you get something like Law 21. It's a defensive, aggressive law against the others. There are many explanations for it we don't have time to go into. But Quebec is an outlier.
I was wondering if it's actually a rejection of this idea of dual loyalty, because in Quebec, for me, Law 21 is a rejection of any loyalty other than to Quebec.
You could interpret it that way if you want. Yes, I think that, well, the hyphenated Quebecer syndrome. I mean, progressive Quebec nationalists welcome this. But there are many Quebec nationalists who are not so progressive. And so they would be opposed to that. And in fact, if you look at the history of Quebec nationalism since the 1960s, there's been a tension between the more progressive and the more traditional nationalist elements within the Quebec nationalist movement as to where they're going to go. But apparently, 60 or 70% of the Quebec population supports Bill 21. That's a high percentage.
So I'm a foreigner commenting on this. So I have 2 points, right? So to the extent that Bill 21 is modeled on the model of laïcité from France, I think when thinking about how your law should deal with religious minorities, one should look closely at the French experience and then do something else. I think it's a bad model. One thing that is striking to me is to the extent that one of the motivating things that is the beads in everybody's bonnet is the hijab. Right? It is striking to me is the number of times and places at which the anxiety and focus about these outsiders that are coming in here is about women. And it's about sexuality, and it's about the way in which their women are acting that we think is really kind of scary, right? actually made in Latter-day Saint situation, right? So Mormon men get prosecuted for violating the anti-bigamy laws. There are actually a number of cases in which Mormon women were prosecuted, and they were actually prosecuted for violating anti-fornication laws, and that's actually the law that you use. It was literally the statute that was used to prosecute prostitutes. So I do think that there is a way in which oftentimes women and sexuality becomes the kind of anvil on which people pound out these issues. And I am assuming that the Quebec law is not really aimed at yarmulkes or crucifixes as much as it's aimed at Christians.
Coming down to the end of it, Professor Wen maybe has a last question. We'll see how the time goes.
Just wondering, Professor Oman, if you might speak a little bit about kind of as much as you might project, the future of kind of Latter-day Saint political space in terms of, so like 2016, the rise of Trump, in a way almost sort of, it was a test of just like how Republicans, Latter-day Saints were, and there was some work, actually, there was some wondering actually if we couldn't make the same Utah because there was a rise of this Latter-day Saint candidate and whatnot. And that didn't happen, but now we have, Mitt Romney, we have, Senator Flake who resigned because we have this rising kind of, resistance to Trump. It's unclear where that will go, but I don't know if you could foresee some of this. I'm just curious what you see for the future.
As a moderately devout Latter-day Saint who is not especially enamored with Trump, I really want to believe, right, in some narrative in which American Latter-day Saints, despite their long history going back to the 60s of association with the Republican Party, sort of reject Donald Trump. So I really want to believe that. On the other hand, I'm also kind of a skeptical academic, and so here's what my understanding is of the political science literature is that partisan identities are very, very sticky. Especially if you look at the level of group partisan identities. So groups don't change partisan identities very often. They don't change it very much. What is striking about the 2016 election, and I actually ran all the numbers on these, and what I was interested in looking at was the state where there was the largest Trump effect. That is, I compared the voting patterns from the 2012 election and the 2016 election, and I saw which states had the biggest partisan swing, right, one way or the other. And so some of those states was, one of the largest states was West Virginia. So West Virginia liked Romney a little bit. West Virginia really, really liked Trump. And so there was a positive swing towards Trump. There was a negative swing in some states, right, where there were some states that were like, they disliked Romney, but they really disliked Trump. The biggest swing was in Utah, and it actually wasn't even close. The effect of the Trump effect in Utah dwarfed the effect in every other state. So the swing in Utah was a partisan swing against the Republican Party of about 20-25%, which still leaves Trump with a comfortable majority in Utah. But in political science terms, a swing of 25% in partisan identification or partisan voting of a group is